When a mom sees the family dog topple her disabled son's wheelchair with seemingly no reason, she screams in horror. But the truth will leave her in complete shock. The panicked barking tore through the house like a siren. Sarah's heart pounded as she raced towards her son's room. Her breath hitched as she flung the door open. Ben was sprawled on the floor, his wheelchair was overturned beside him, blood seeped from a deep gash on his arm staining the carpet crimson. And there over her son was Max, the gentle service dog, her son's guardian, had his teeth bared in a vicious snarl. An unfamiliar guttural growl resonated from his throat when she saw what the dog did to her disabled son. Sarah screamed, a raw, helpless sound that echoed off the walls. Just 10 minutes later, sirens wailed. In the stillness of their quiet street, a blur of paramedics rushed past Sarah, pushing a gurney with Ben's small form strapped on top. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Her voice was a choked whisper as she repeated fragments of what happened. She didn't know where she found the strength to drive to the hospital. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours as Sarah sat in the sterile hospital waiting room. A detective Ramirez introduced himself and asked her to describe the attack in detail, but to her, it was all hazy. The memory felt out of place. Max's familiar brown eyes were different. There was something wild and unfamiliar in them as he stood over Ben. His snarl, the guttural menacing sound, still echoed in her ears. The force with which he had knocked over Ben's wheelchair and left him vulnerable on the floor must have been uncanny. But he's a service dog, Sarah added, shaking her head. Max would never hurt Ben. They adore each other, Detective Ramirez scribbled in his notebook. He said even trained dogs are animals. A door opened and a grim-faced veterinarian approached. He told Sarah that Max had been taken to a shelter. They understood he was a service animal, but they had to follow protocol. Sarah's world tilted further off its axis. Her heart ached for both her son and his protector. Somehow she knew they were both victims of this inexplicable horror. In the chaos, Ramirez asked if there was anyone else who had regular contact with Ben. The insinuation stung, but a sliver of uncertainty took root. Had she missed something, overlooked some vital clue in the whirlwind of caring for Ben? Had she become blind to subtle changes? Pain, doubt, and a creeping fear swirled into a nauseating cocktail within her. She tried to force order onto her scattered thoughts. There's a physical therapist who works with Ben a few times a week, and there's a new neighbor who moved in recently. She's been very friendly. A sense of unease prickled at Sarah's skin. The neighbor, Emily, always seemed a bit too eager, too interested in Ben's condition. Now, with hindsight's cruel clarity, Sarah noticed those interactions in a new, far more sinister light. Ramirez promised to look into it. He tucked his notebook away and told her he thought this might be more than a simple dog attack. As Sarah headed for the door, he stopped her. He held up an open bag of Cheetos and asked if it was Ben's. They'd found it on the floor next to his wheelchair. Sarah shook her head. Ben didn't eat Cheetos. Maybe he was trying it out to see if he liked the taste now that he was a little older. Her mind raced all the way to the hospital. Had she, in her desperation for normalcy and support, unknowingly put her own son in danger? Each sterile beep of the heart monitor was a hammer blow against her already strained nerves. Ben slept. The sight of his bandaged arm was a constant, painful reminder of her failure to protect him. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. He had escaped the attack with just a fractured arm and some serious muscle tears, but it could have been way worse. Guilt clawed its way up Sarah's throat. Detective Ramirez returned. This time, his questions felt like a brutal interrogation. Sarah recounted the limited details, questions about Max, Ben's routine, and the attack itself all swirled together in a nauseating fog. Then, a glimmer of memory. She remembered Ben had seemed a little different lately, and told Ramirez so. He was quieter and seemed less willing to do his exercises, and he'd been frustrated, sometimes bordering on anger. The detective's eyebrows lifted. He asked if there were any behavior changes after Max joined the family. Sarah's mind searched all of its nooks and crannies. Max had eased Ben's transition into life with a disability. He offered companionship and a constant sense of security. Could something have happened between the two of them? She shook her head. Then Ramirez asked about the new neighbor. Images of Emily flashed through Sarah's mind. Her bright smiles, the eagerness with which she'd offered to babysit or run errands. Sarah had initially been grateful for the support, but now, recalling those moments, a disquieting feeling surfaced. Emily always seemed a little too fascinated by Ben's disability, and she was a little too insistent on spending time with him alone. Sarah relayed these interactions to Detective Ramirez. Had she welcomed a wolf into their home without even realizing it? Had her desire for respite blinded her to the lurking dangers? As the detective took notes, a chilling thought seized Sarah. The accident, Max's uncharacteristic aggression, what if they weren't a mere coincidence? What if it was all part of something far more sinister? Panic flared in her chest, a raw, desperate need to protect her son. Sarah sought out Emily before she returned home. The woman's initial surprise quickly morphed into a mask of practiced concern. However, Sarah was no longer blinded by her friendly facade. She searched her neighbor's eyes. Instead of warmth, she found guardedness, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. The conversation was stilted. Emily's inquiries about Ben seemed forced. Despite her well-crafted facade, Sarah resisted the urge to scream accusations. She knew she needed proof, something solid to break through the woman's pleasant veneer. Fueled by adrenaline and a protective fury, Sarah turned investigator. It started with simple internet searches, social media profiles, and public records, mostly Emily's. Seemingly wholesome image began to crack. Unsettling inconsistencies emerged. There were employment gaps, sudden relocations, and a tendency to disappear from social media for extended periods. It painted the portrait of a woman who could easily reinvent herself and slip unnoticed into new settings. Each unearthed detail chipped away at the image of a harmless, caring neighbor. A sense of dread coiled in Sarah's gut. What if Emily's seemingly innocent interest masked something far more sinister? What if her obsession with Ben's disability went beyond mere curiosity? Sarah's determination hardened. She couldn't stand by and let Ben become another entry in this woman's twisted narrative. She would protect her son no matter the cost, but first, she had to check on Max. The animal shelter was a symphony of despair. Barks and whimpers echoed off the sterile concrete walls. Sarah found Max tucked away in the far corner. The sight of her usually exuberant dog, huddled with its tail between his legs, was a fresh blow. His once bright eyes now held a hollow sadness. A low whine escaped him as Sarah approached. She whispered apologies, but the words caught in her throat. How could she ever have doubted him? A kind-faced veterinarian appeared beside her. He'd been the one to assess Max after his arrival. I understand your concerns, he said. Animal behavior can be unpredictable, even in trained dogs. He paused and placed a gentle hand on Max's trembling body. He's showing signs of stress, perhaps some trauma. This can manifest in different ways, sometimes even aggression. The vet told her there might well be more to this than met the eye. Perhaps Max had sensed a change in Ben, a threat they were yet to fully understand. Sarah felt a chill creeping down her spine. The vet's words echoed Detective Ramirez's earlier suggestion that there might be more to the incident than a simple dog attack. Could someone have deliberately agitated Max to provoke his fierce protective instincts into overdrive? Had Ben's beloved companion become an unwitting weapon? A new twisted image formed in Sarah's mind. Emily, with her saccharine smiles and obsessive interest in Ben, had she somehow discovered a way to manipulate Max, to break the dog's gentle nature? The police station's fluorescent lights and stale air provided no comfort. Detective Ramirez sat opposite Sarah, his expression remained carefully neutral as she related her visit to the animal shelter and the vet's suspicions. Doubt about Max nagged at her, but it was swiftly outweighed by chilling certainty. There was another player involved in this, and it was someone who understood how to manipulate both dogs and humans, the detective scribbled in his notebook. A thoughtful frown creased his brow. "It seems your neighbor is a person of interest in another case," he said cryptically. "We might have some questions for her sooner rather than later." The ride home was a blur. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. If Emily was indeed involved, was Ben even safe? At the hospital, 2 days later, Ben was dismissed. He and Sarah fetched Max from the shelter. He'd been carefully observed, and the vet had determined that the animal, though stressed, showed no traits of aggression. This wasn't something they could hold the dog accountable for. Both Ben and Sarah were overjoyed. Ben had his companion back, and Sarah felt infinitely safer with Max in the house. Slowly, the household settled back into predictable rhythms. Sarah returned to work, but as a special concession, she was only expected to be at the office half-days. And Ben eased back into his life with Max weeks later. Sarah had a needling dread in her heart. The whole of that Tuesday morning, eventually, at 1 p.m., she raced home. The house was empty. A note on the fridge said Emily had come over to take Ben to the doctor. Sarah's anxiety grew with each tick of the clock. Hours blurred until the flicker of headlights swung into the driveway. Sarah's stomach lurched as Emily helped Ben out with exaggerated care. Then it happened. She leaned closer to the boy, not with support, but with a possessiveness that made Sarah gasp. Ben pulled away. Rage flashed across Emily's face, and she lunged towards the boy. He recoiled, but his balance was precarious, and his wheelchair toppled sideways. A scream built in Sarah's throat. Like a shot, Max was there. Sarah knew he'd sensed the rising tension. He barreled into Emily, knocking her aside with surprising force. She went down hard. A cry tore from her lips. Ben fell as well, but Max cushioned him. Sarah was running by then. She knelt beside Ben. He blinked up at her, dazed but unharmed. Max crouched over Emily, but confrontation was no longer necessary. She was a crumpled figure, sobs racking her body. Detective Ramirez's arrival was almost anticlimactic. Sarah had barely registered calling him, but he was suddenly there, and he took Emily away. The next morning, Ramirez popped in again. He held out a familiar object, her purse. A knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. This was in Emily's car. His words dropped like stones. Comprehension dawned in waves of horror. Her purse, with its neatly stored calendar marking Ben's appointments and the sticky note of his therapist's address, it was the missing link, the careless detail Emily had latched onto and twisted into a weapon. Then Detective Ramirez told her everything. His investigation had revealed a darker truth about Emily. She was the driver in the accident that had left Ben paralyzed. She was drawn by a chilling obsession and reappeared in their lives. Trauma, Detective Ramirez explained, can twist minds in unimaginable ways. For Sarah, understanding Emily's motives wouldn't erase the scars, but it did offer a fragile kind of closure. But what about Max, she wondered. It was as if Ramirez read her thoughts. They had run tests on the Cheetos they found on the floor after the incident. It was laced with something that could have caused organ failure and death. He told Sarah, in her warped mind, Emily figured if Ben died, her guilt would too. Max had picked up that the Cheetos weren't safe. He'd probably tried to snatch it away from his owner's hand first. When that didn't work, he had no choice but to topple the boy over. 5 years on, Sarah, Ben, and Max were a family redefined. The wounds of the past had faded into scars. Max was a little older now and seemed to have forgotten all about the shelter and the accusations. Ben was in his teens. He was a handsome boy who outshone his classmates in science and math. Sarah found joy in everyday moments. She was building a life unshaken by the shadows of the past and was as determined as ever to give Ben the best life she could. As for Emily, she was still in the psychiatric ward. She'd had a complete psychotic break. Sarah's heart broke for her. She had found the strength to forgive her, but she would never forget and would never trust another neighbor again.